Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Book of the Covenant with Rabbi David Silber. This class is part of his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. This term, he will provide an analysis of the laws of Shemot 21 to 23 that are central to the Covenant of Sinai. It has been a pleasure learning with Rabbi Silber these past several Sundays, and thank you, everyone, for continuing to come back. Sources for today's class will come from Exodus 21. If you have your own Tanakh at hand, you're certainly welcome to use it, but sources will also be shared on screen from Sfaria. If you have questions, you're certainly welcome to ask them in chat or wait for when Rabbi Silber pauses to take questions. My only request is, if you are not actively speaking, to please mute yourself so that we don't pick up on any background noise. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, just to set out what our plan is for these next. This session meets for 5 weeks during the Sphira. So those who were in the previous sessions, we will focus on the story of the golden calf, the Egel. We didn't complete the Egel story. We got up to the point where Moshe comes down the mountain and sees what's happening. He breaks the luchot. He's going to go back now and try to reconcile the people with God, and eventually succeeds in getting a second set of tablets, etc. So we didn't complete that story, but I thought that instead of completing the story now, we would wait with that, and the plan would be to go back, because we skipped after the receiving of the Torah at Sinai, the Aseret HaDibrot. So at the end of that section, the people go to Moshe and say, we don't want to hear God's voice anymore. God's voice is frightening. Why don't you speak to us instead? And Moshe and God agree. And Moshe goes back to God and to receive more commandments. And those commandments, those additional commandments, are found at the very end of chapter 20. The end of chapter 20. There are a few verses at the end of chapter 20, beginning with just a few verses before chapter 21. I'll just read it. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Ko tomar el bnei Yisrael, atem reitem, ki min hashemayim dibarti el imachem. Okay, you've seen, I spoke to you from heaven. And then God begins to command. There are just a few commandments at the end of chapter 20. Just a few. Lo tasuni ti, Elohi chesed, Elohi zahav, lo tasu lachem. Have no gods of silver, gods of gold. That's one command. And when you make an altar, it should be an altar of earth. Mizbach adamah tasali. And there are rules about the altar. You should not use metal implements making the altar. You should not walk on steps. You should not reveal your nakedness upon it. And that's the end of chapter 20. So those laws, basically, especially beginning with the first one, seem to be some kind of embellishment of the first of what we call the 10 Commandments. I am the God who took you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. That's how the Aseret HaDibrot begin. And then the people say, we don't want to hear any more from God. We're afraid of God's voice. And Moshe says, that's fine. Moshe goes up alone to receive more instruction. And the first instruction is, you shall have no other gods with me, which is what God said in the beginning of the 10 Dibrot. Here the Torah adds, Elohei chesed, Elohei zahav, lo tasu lachem. You shall have no gods of silver or gods of gold. So that was the first thing that Moshe told alone. And then in chapter 21, in which we're going to have our focus, there are additional rules called mishpatim. I just wanted to point out a couple of things and just to say what the plan is here. First of all, it's important to remember, and we did start the story of the golden calf. We skipped over the construction of the Mishkan. We jumped right away to the golden calf. And the golden calf is, of course, a violation, not only of the first of the Aseret HaDibrot, but actually an explicit violation of what we have in the end of chapter 20, when the people say to Moshe, you give us the additional rules. And the first thing Moshe is told is Elohei Chesed, Elohei Zahav, Lo Tasu Lachem. Make you for yourselves no gods of silver, no gods of gold. And of course, the Egel HaZahav is the golden calf. So the point of the Egel and the great significance of the Egel, it's not just that it's a sin, but it's a violation, an explicit violation of the whole episode of Sinai. The tablets of Sinai will call the tablets of the covenant, Shnei Luchot HaBrit. So the golden calf is not just a sin, but a breaking of the covenant. And that's the great significance of the golden calf. And once Moshe broke those tablets, when he comes down the mountain, this is one of the points that we emphasized in our previous study, he makes it impossible to build the Mishkan. Because unlike everything else in the Mishkan, which is constructed by the workers, human ingenuity, Betzalel and his crew and the volunteers, the men, the women, they're called Chachamim, skilled craftspeople. So this is a violation, and that's the great significance. And Moshe is going to attempt to reconnect the people in God. He will succeed at the end, but we didn't get into how he succeeds. And we're going to pick that up later when we focus on the Mishkan, because what Moshe is trying to do is to allow God to dwell amongst the people. What God says to Moshe in chapter 33, we pretty much left off there, was that I'm going to send my angel. I'm not going to go myself. I can't go with you, because if I go with you, I will fight and I'll destroy you. So I'll send someone in my place. The angel will help you capture the land. The angel will bring you safely into the land, etc. But I'm not going to go with you. And that's the whole story that of Moshe's attempt, and successful at the end, of reconnecting God with the people. And then you can build the Mishkan. So the plan for these sessions is this. We're going to go back to what we skipped in chapter 21. And we're going to look at some of the laws that are in the section called the Mishpatim. Mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. And we complete that. We'll see how many of these laws we're going to do. We're certainly going to spend the next these five sessions on the laws. Maybe we'll go beyond that. Won't do everything. And then afterwards, we'll jump back to the golden calf, and then we will discuss the Mishkan. There are 10 chapters devoted to the Mishkan, and that will be the completion of the book of Shemot. So that's the plan moving forward. Okay, so we have here chapter 21. These are called the Mishpatim. V'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. In other words, now the Mishpatim, because what I spoke about in the previous few verses, namely, have no other gods before me. If you make an altar, it should be an altar, an earthen altar, all of that. Those are not Mishpatim. Those are rules, but they're not really Mishpatim. The Mishpatim are something different. Most of the Mishpatim have to do with human interaction. Beginning with the first, but most of it is, it's not only about, there is some ritual law here as well, but most of it is about human relationships. And these laws, let me just give a brief introduction here. The Torah has a few of these sections of law. This section is known as the Sefer HaBrit, the Book of the Covenant. There's a whole section over here. There's a section in the book of Vayikra, of Parshat Kedoshim, the holiness code, they call it. It's another section. In the book of Devarim, there are a couple of very long sections about law, dealing mostly with marriage laws, laws of war, many laws. So the Torah is not overall a law book. So Rashi says that's the focus. The Torah is largely stories, but interspersed are many laws. And there are a few sections in the Torah where there are a whole set of laws. This is one of them, Mishpatim. Now, none of these sets of laws is a complete set of law. Each one has a particular focus. Each one has some laws, and many of the laws are simply not there in each of the sections. So we have to remember that. But these are the Mishpatim, And at the end, when Moshe comes down the mountain in chapter 24, he writes these laws down. And the book in which he writes it is called the Book of the Covenant, Sefer HaBrit. That's why these are called, these laws generally known as the laws of the Book of the Covenant. And it is interesting that the covenant between God and the people is based to a very large extent on laws such as if you dig a pit and an animal falls in, you have to pay for it, etc. So there's a real focus over here on human behavior and the way people behave towards each other. This is the plan of our study moving forward, and this is the section we're going to be looking at. Now, I just wanted to give one brief introduction, then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. This has to be said before we begin our study of Mishpatim, and that is, it is well known in many circles that these laws, these Mishpatim, I first specifically to the Mishpatim, it's not just these laws, but let's say Mishpatim in particular, because that's what we're looking at, that there are other, we have discovered over the past 125 years, archaeologists discovered other sets of laws from the ancient Near East. The most famous of them would be Hammurabi's Code. And Hammurabi's Code, which was discovered on this long, what they call a stele, 7 foot, is not a complete set of laws, but there are many laws. And what's very striking is Hammurabi's Code, discovered in 1901. It dates for around the year 1800 BCE. That is, whenever the dates for the Torah are, they're well after that. Hundreds of years before the Torah. We have laws, many of which are strikingly parallel to what we have in Parshat Mishpatim. That's just a fact. I mean, you can read it, you'll see for yourself. Very strikingly similar, some of it. There are differences, and that's important. So that's one very famous code. And then there's an earlier code, maybe 100 years earlier, known as the laws of Eshnuna. Similar to Hammurabi, maybe even influenced Hammurabi, unclear and all that. But that's around the year, they think around the year 1900. It's in Iraq. They discovered it in Iraq. And there's even an earlier code for about the year 2100. So many of the students of the Bible, actually, when you're studying these legal sections, it's no secret that you have these other codes, and they are strikingly similar. I mean, whether one studies them or not, they do actually exist. And the same is true of other parts of the Torah. For example, the story of the flood of Noah. There are many stories from the ancient Near East, Gilgamesh, many of them, which have striking similarities to what we find in the Torah. So the question is, what do we do with all this is a very good question. But the fact of the matter is that one thing to think about, I wanted to mention this at the outset, this is actually a very important point. What's interesting to look at actually is are the differences. I mean, Kasuto argued in his commentary on Breshit that the Torah is actually responding to these other stories. The Torah is saying, we have our story, it's different. And Kasuto, that's Kasuto's the main thrust of Kasuto's work on Breshit is exactly to argue that the Torah is responding to these other stories, which have striking similarities, especially the story of the flood. And when it comes to the laws, there's an essay by Moshe Greenberg, a very important essay, where he highlights certain differences between the rules that we have, the laws that we find in Mishpatim, and we will be studying some of them, and the laws that we find in other ancient codes, which precede the Torah by many years. For one thing, the laws the laws of the Torah are given. Moshe is simply reporting what God says. Moshe never claims to be a lawgiver. Hammurabi does. Moshe does not. That's one important difference. Another important difference would be that the laws of the Torah are not just laws between, it's probably related to this, but they are not just laws about damages, not just civil law or even criminal law, but mixed in with the civil and the criminal law is also ritual law. It's one God who gives both. It's the God who has ritual law, commands us about how to behave, how to visit the temple, sacrifices, all that. How we deal with our crops, setting aside certain portions. So for the Torah, it's all one thing. It's all connected. It's true in Mishpatim, it's true in Kedoshim, etc. The combination, the two come together, which is related to the idea that it's God who's giving the laws. But there's actually many other important differences between or ideas that come through the set of laws. And I want to mention one in particular, which will be an introduction to how we're going to start. And that is that I mentioned 2 points. First of all, in the laws of, say, Hammurabi, there's a very striking distinction which is drawn there between what they call a free person or a higher class person and others of lower class, the commoners and the slaves. And there are different rules for each one, striking differences. The Chumash has a little of that, but fundamentally the Chumash doesn't eliminate it, but it downplays it, severely downplays it. There's much more a sense of people being treated the same. That's number one. And the second point that Greenberg makes, which is I think the most important point, is that in the Torah, there's a distinction which is drawn between monetary payments on one hand and capital crimes, something like murder. For murder in the Chumash, there is no punishment except it's a capital offense, except death, life for life. But you can't pay your way out. And you can't pay your way out, not only to get off to commute the sentence of the death sentence. You can pay money. You can't do that. You can't later on in the Torah even pay money to escape going into exile. That is to say, if one kills accidentally, which will also appear in the beginning of our study in Mishpatim, the Torah says you cannot take money to allow the unpremeditated murderer to escape the city of refuge. You can't do that. The one who kills in unpremeditated way must go to the city of refuge, the Ir Miklat. So in the Torah, there's this very sharp distinction which is drawn between those crimes that have a capital crimes. I gave murder as the example, and no payment, no monetary payment will work. That's not true of the other codes. In the other codes, very often you can pay your way out. So that's something that will probably come across in our study. The point being that it may be related. The text may be deeply related to each other. The Torah may be writing in response to Hammurabi or other codes. It's hard to know. But having said that, even though it's related, it doesn't necessarily, it has its own path. It has its own set of values. And I want to make one other point, actually, which I think I made in the past, and then I'll be the end of this introduction, and I'll take any comments or questions. And that is Pesach. We had Pesach a couple of weeks ago. And so the Seder, of course, central ritual. And one of the interesting discussions about the Seder, which comes up in many circles, is the parallels between the Seder on one hand and what's called the Greek Symposium on the other. There are all kinds of interesting parallels between them. And the question that scholars debate is to what extent the Greek Symposium influenced the way the Seder is in fact constructed. It's actually a very interesting question, and there are many parallels. But I want to make a point about the parallels, which is, I think, an important point, not only about the Seder, but in general. Traditions, religions are often influenced by their surroundings. Human beings are influenced by their surroundings. And consciously, or sometimes unconsciously, certain elements of other traditions, certain practices become part of one's own religion or one's own tradition. For example, the symposium had several, wine was drunk more than once, several cups of wine, whatever the number, 2, 3, whatever it is. But I think the important point to remember, and this is not just about the symposium, it's in general, that when a culture or tradition imports practices from outside, once they become part of your tradition or your system, they take on a different cast. So that I'll give the example of the wine. It could be that in the symposium they had cups of wine, and at the Seder there are cups of wine. But when you import the cups of wine into the Seder, it suddenly becomes part of something very different. Because within our tradition, there's something called the kos shel bracha. One makes kiddush over a cup of wine. Kiddush is a statement. One makes havdalah holding a cup of wine. One makes blessings at a wedding over a cup of wine. The point of the Seder is that you begin with kiddush, with a cup of wine. We have the birkat hamazon after the meal, cup of wine. That's done in general. Kiddush is always over wine. You could have sometimes substitutions, but fundamentally it's over wine. Birkat hamazon is optional, but at gala celebrations, it's often the kiddush is made over a cup of wine. But at the Seder, it's not just that the kiddush and the birkat hamazon is recited over a cup of wine, but there are cups of wine for the telling of the story. At the end of the story, you make a blessing holding a cup of wine, and we say Hallel at the Seder, holding a cup of wine. There's a concept called the kos shel bracha. So when you import something from outside, willy-nilly, it takes on a different cast. It becomes something different because it becomes part of a whole other system. And when it becomes part of another system, the interesting question actually is, how is this now understood? Okay, maybe it came from outside. Let's assume it did. It doesn't matter. But once it did come from outside, it becomes transformed. That's something always to remember. It becomes transformed. So I mentioned that in terms of some of these laws. Some of these laws are strikingly similar. When you think about the laws in the larger context of all of the laws, then suddenly they present themselves very, very differently. All this in the introduction to our study. We're going to begin with chapter 21 to the Mishpatim. We're not going to do everything. We're going to focus on several of the Mishpatim that we find in these chapters. Okay, so we're set to go. Before I begin now with chapter 21, if there are any comments or questions, please speak up.
Yes, the phrasing, asher tosen lifnehem,
Yes.
which is so unusual in that you don't speak to them or say to them. It seems like God is treating them as a rebellious bunch. It says you shove it in front of them and they're not going to listen anyway.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, but I mean, you're certainly right about asher tosim lifnehem is unusual. It could have said, Ela mishpatim asher tidaber alehem. What does tosim lifnehem mean? You know, so what is, and who is the lifnehem? The first question. Who is the lifnehem? Who is the subject in the first verse? Is it the people generally, or is it those people that are going to be administering the law, the judges? That's actually an interesting question, which I wanted to begin with. Who is the lifnehem? And I would just leave that for a minute. Is there any question about anything that I've said to this point?
Yes, Rabbi Silber, there are 2 questions in chat in reverse chronological order.
Yeah.
First, from Neva, she wants to know what the essay by Moshe Greenberg that you brought up is and where she can find it.
Okay, it's in a book. The name of the book is Studies in the Bible and Jewish Thought. It's a big book. They have a bunch of different essays. And one of those essays is about this. It's very interesting. You know, all kinds of interesting essays in here. Let me see if I can find this. Now we have to look. It would take time now to find it. It's in this book, though. Again, the book is called Studies in the Bible and Jewish Thought, Moshe Greenberg. Okay, that's the book. All right, any other questions? There's another question, let's hear. Yes, I can't hear you.
There's also one other question, just
Yes.
from Susan Lieberman. Quote, when did Moshe write down these laws on the mountain or after he came down? How much of the Torah was given to Moshe on Har Sinai?
Right, so that's a question about the whole, we discussed in the past, the order of all this. The simple reading is, he writes it down as soon as he comes back. He goes up for maybe a day or two. He just gets these laws, he writes them down. And chapter 24 is where you have this. In chapter 24, it says he writes it down. He reads it to the people, right? Let me find chapter 24, the order is. In chapter 24, so it says, right, so it says Moshe tells the people in chapter 24 in the third pasuk. So Moshe, this is how the Ramban understands it. He comes right down. So the people were afraid to hear God's voice. So God gives us rules to Moshe. He comes right away down the mountain. He says, this is what God told me. And the people say, whatever God says, we're going to do. Naaseh. Then Moshe writes it down. Chapter 24, verse number 4. Vayichtov Moshe et kol divrei Hashem. He writes it down. Then he builds an altar, or 12 altars, and he sets up 12 pillars, and then he reads it to them, and then the people say Naaseh v'nishma. He brings the sacrifice. So, and the Torah says he took the Sefer HaBrit in verse number 7. Vayikach Sefer HaBrit vayikra b'yaznei. So it's interesting. First he tells it to them orally, and then he reads it to them. So the reading to them sounds like something formal. It's like a contract, you know. You discuss. If I do this, I want to sell my house. Do you want to buy it? What's it? Okay, we agree, and then we write it up. Then we write a contract. So that's what seems to be in chapter 24. First, he discusses it with them. Interested in this? Yeah, whatever God says, we'll do. Okay, so we're going to formalize it. So there's a formal agreement, and then the book that he writes it down in. The Torah says, Vayikach Sefer HaBrit, the book of the covenant. So I want to emphasize this point. It's a very important point. Naaseh v'nishma, that's familiar to us. The covenant is explicit in chapter 24. In other words, the simple reading is that the covenant with God at Mount Sinai has two parts to it. One are these 10 commandments, okay? And then there are many other commandments, beginning with the end of chapter 20 and all the way through chapters 21, 22, 23. And that becomes formalized in chapter 24, so that the book of the covenant actually are these laws, which we're going to get to. And it's rather striking because these are not necessarily, when one thinks of a covenant with God, we don't think about what happens if my ox bores your ox, or you fall into a pit, etc. But that is actually a big piece of this covenant, and it's reflected, I think, in terms of the Talmud. I mean, the Talmud has 6 different sections to it, but there is a section of Nezikin. There's Bava Metzia, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra, etc. All these laws and rules about how society should govern itself is very central. So that's something about Judaism that's very central. That the rules, the laws, and all that, the behaviors are very essential. And it emerges right out of the Chumash. There's no question about that. Okay, I think we're ready to start our journey now at chapter 21. So let me begin with Laszlo's point. Now the question is, who was the Lifneihem? That's why I would start. You shall place these rules before them. So who was the before them? Now, there are two possibilities. One is that the Torah is talking about having a system of justice. So basically, the ones who are going to deal with this will be the judges. Asher Tosim Lifneihem, the judges. That's certainly one possible reading. The other reading is the judges may be implementing it. Hamishpatim Asher Tosim Lifneihem is addressed to the people generally. That's the interpretation personally that I prefer. And in thinking about this verse, I'm reminded actually of the story that we looked at a few weeks ago, namely chapter 18. Chapter 18 is where Moshe is sitting by himself. His father-in-law Yitro has come to visit him, bringing Moshe's two children, his wife, ex-wife, whatever. But he comes with them, and he sees, we are told in the middle of chapter 18, Moshe is sitting by himself, and there's a long line of people standing, waiting to see Moshe. And Yitro says to Moshe, we all remember, what are you doing? What are you doing? What is this? And Moshe says, well, the people have come to seek God. The people have cases. The people have judgments to be heard. Right? People want to understand the rules, all these things. And that's why I'm here. I'm here to teach them. I'm here to be a judge. The disputes between them. And Yitro says to Moshe, what you're doing is no good. Lo tov hadavar asher ata oseh. What you are doing is no good. You'll wither away and they'll wither away. You can't do this. You need help. You need help. So you have to choose people to help you. And they'll deal with the matters. The big issues, the big ones, you deal with. You bring those matters to God. But the other stuff, the people have to handle. Now, when we studied that story, the point that I emphasized was that what Moshe is saying to Yitro is, listen, only God can judge. What right do people have to judge each other? So therefore, since only God can judge, there's only one person who can bring the matters to God, who's in constant contact with God, namely me, says Moshe. So that's why they have to come to me, right? And Yitro says to Moshe, as we explained it then, as we understood it, you're 100% right, but it doesn't work. It's a beautiful theory, but it doesn't work. And therefore, you have to have, you will still bring the things that people can't determine for themselves, that then you bring them, then they bring them to you and you consult with God. But otherwise, the people have to be involved because nobody can do it by himself. That's how we understood it then. But the point over here is, it's more than that. What Yitro is saying is actually more than that. He's saying not just you can't do it by yourself, but Yitro's point is beyond that, is to involve the people in administering justice. And that I think is the focus over here as we begin our study. And the Lifnehem, these are the rules you have to tell the people. The people have to administer these rules. You can't do it by yourself, and the people will do it. And we will see in our study over the course of these 3 chapters that what's interesting is, and the rabbinic tradition wrestles with this problem, that there will be verses which say, if people have a dispute, Ado Elohim Yavod Devar Shnehem, they should bring the matter to Elohim. And the question is how to understand Elohim. Usually, it often means God, typically means God. Does it mean bring the matter to God? Or does it mean bring the matter to the court? Does Elohim mean important people? Or does it mean God? And even if it means God, does it mean God will speak to you by confirming what the court says? So this is, in other words, Moshe's argument that fundamentally justice belongs to God and God alone is a very powerful argument. And Yitro's point then can be understood as saying, you're right in principle, but as a practical matter, it doesn't work. Because otherwise, nobody ever gets justice at all. You have to wait 10 years to get into court. What kind of system is it if you can't actually get a date in court? What kind of system is it if people can avoid going to court? So it's not a system. In order for justice to be justice, it has to be implemented. So Eila Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem, I would argue, that both interpretations are possible. The Lifnehem could be the judges or the people, but I would argue in the spirit of what we saw earlier, that actually it is the people. Okay. That's the first verse. And now we have the beginning of this section of laws. There are many laws here. Let me say before we begin, just another point there is a very famous, I'm just pointing out some of the really famous stuff. There is a very famous Rashbam on this verse. The Rashbam is the grandson of Rashi. He is one of the important medieval exegetes, and important because he was probably more than anybody else. He focused on what we would call nowadays Pshuto Shel Mikra. What does the Torah actually seem to say? Now, the Rashbam is known as a great Talmudist. In fact, we have on some of the Marot where there's no Rashi, we have the Rashbam. But the Rashbam writes very famously in introduction to Parshat Mishpatim. And what the Rashbam writes is, he says, listen, I'm going to interpret this section in terms of what the Torah seems to say. I don't mean to suggest that the Torah Sheba'al Peh, that the halachot we find in the Talmud are insignificant. Quite the opposite. They are the most important thing of all. But that's not my commentary. I'm just going to tell you what I think the Torah actually says. The halacha is derived in other ways, from seeming duplications, from extra letters, extra words. That's all valid, says the Rashbam. But I'm going to tell you what the Torah says and the plain meaning of the Torah. So this is a very, very famous Rashbam where he sets out from the very beginning his approach to the study of the Torah. And what's interesting in the Rashbam, and we'll come across this later in other contexts, he never makes an attempt, does the Rashbam, ever, to the best of my knowledge, to reconcile. The plain meaning is X. The halacha is not X. Okay, how do you resolve that problem? What is it? The two different, he seems to say there are two different ways to read. One has nothing to do with the other. It can be read one way, it can be read another way. And the two things have really just to operate on two different planes. That's the Rashbam. In contrast to the Ramban. The Ramban, who follows a somewhat similar path as the Rashbam, is interested in what the Torah seems to be saying. But the Ramban often attempts to reconcile the rabbinic understanding with the what appears to be the plain meaning of the Torah. We will come in our study in these few weeks, we will come across this problem on a couple of some very striking way in a couple of different settings, some of the verses. So that's important to know. Okay. That's the famous Rashbam. Now let's begin. Ki tikneh eved ivri sheish shonim yavod uvashvi'it yetzei lachofshi chinam. The first law, the first of the Mishpatim, is about slavery. When you buy an Eved Ivri, so Eved Ivri, you could interpret Eved Ivri, the words Eved Ivri, in a couple of different ways. The way it's understood rabbinically, and it could be the plain meaning as well, a Hebrew slave. I could think of two other possible ways to read Eved Ivri. First of all, we could read Eved Ivri as when you buy a slave from a Hebrew, Eved Ivri. If I buy a slave from a non-Ivri, say non-Jew, then maybe you can keep the slave forever. But if you buy a slave from a fellow Jew, then the slave has to be freed in the seventh year. That's one possible understanding, which the traditional commentaries reject. And then you could say something else, that Eved Ivri, who says the word Ivri means a Jew altogether? The word Ivri literally means one from the other side. And when the word Ivri is used in the Chumash, actually, in Sefer Breshit, that's exactly what it means. In other words, Joseph is an Ivri. He is a Jew. But the point of Joseph is Ivri Anochi, right? The Jonah says Ivri Anochi. He's talking to people. In other words, Jonah's on the boat. He's running off, right, to Tarshish. And the sailors say, who are you? The boat is a raging storm. Ivri Anochi, right? He says, I'm not from here. I'm from a different place. Or Joseph is called the Ivri. So one could have said, if you buy a foreign slave, that's not how it's rabbinically understood. The word Ivri is always in that context, though. The word Ivri, whether it refers to Jew or not, it typically does. But it's when the Jew is talking to somebody who sees the Jew as the outsider. Joseph in Egypt is the Ivri. Abraham in chapter 14 of Genesis is the Ivri. He's told about a war. He's living with the Canaanites. And the Ivri is told by somebody that his nephew has been captured about the war. But the context, he's wisely the Ivri because he's not from there. He comes from another place. He dwells with the Canaanites. It's not his business basically, but nonetheless he musters his troops and goes to rescue Lot. He rescues Sodom, etc. In any event, but it's understood rabbinically as the Hebrew slave, as opposed to a non-Jewish slave. This parsha talks about the Eved Ivri. And the first rule is the Eved Ivri shall work for 6 years. In the 7th year, Yetzei lachofshi chinam, he goes out free without payment. Now, I want to make a point about the Mishpatim. I mean, what I'm saying is going to be probably obvious to everybody, but I want to say it anyway. We have a whole set of laws over here. And what's always interesting to think about is the order. The first law, and actually the one given the most space in these 3 chapters, is law relating to slavery. And the reason for that clearly is the Ramban says what's tied in with the first of the 10 commandments. I am the God who took you out of Egypt, right? Anochi Hashem Elohecha asher hotziticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avodim. I took you out of the house of bondage, the house of slavery. So that's the first of the 10 commandments, right? That's the introduction to the 10 commandments. So it's not surprising that the first of the Mishpatim is also about slavery. But I think we could go beyond the Ramban here. And the Ramban would certainly agree with this, I think. And that is that the book is about the story of Exodus is about slavery. It's about freeing the slaves. Moses' job is to free the slaves, right? That's Moses' job. That's God's desire. In other words, the point is that in reading this set of laws in Parshat beginning in Mishpatim, we read them in the context of the book. There's a relationship between the laws of Exodus and the narrative of Exodus. Okay, that's an important point. We'll get back to this point later on. It's a very central point over here. We'll get to it. Now let me make some obvious observations. The Torah here does not eliminate slavery. Let's just start with that. The Torah didn't say there are no slaves. The Torah did not say that. The Torah said if you purchase a slave, the slave works for 6 years and goes free in the 7th. Goes free, chinam, without payment in the 7th year. It's parallel, I think, to the Shabbat, also in the 10 Commandments, the great length. You work for 6 days and you go free on the 7th day. So the point is, the Torah does not eliminate slavery, but the Torah limits slavery. Slavery will be forever. You're a slave forever. You never go free. In the Chumash is saying no. If you purchase a slave, the slave works for a limited amount of time. So I would say the Torah is moving to curtail slavery. The rabbinic tradition tries to eliminate it, actually. But the point is, it sets something in motion. And I think that it's an important point to make over here. It's a point, actually, that Yitz Greenberg, actually, it's one of his main arguments in terms of his understanding of the tradition, that things don't happen just like that essentially the Torah sets things in motion, and then we have this oral tradition, which sort of operates in the spirit of the Torah, and then ends up trying to further curtail slavery and actually to eliminate it. We're talking here about Hebrew slaves. We're not talking about non-Jewish slaves. That's another conversation. But in terms of the Eved Ivri, it's clear from the Chumash that the Chumash is not in favor of slavery. That's clear from the narrative. The whole point of the book is to free the people from slavery. So then one might say it's remarkable in a certain sense that when the Torah speaks in the rules, it doesn't just say no more slavery. It doesn't say that. It says you work for 6 years and you go free in the 7th. Now you go free without payment in the 7th. They say lachofshi chinam. So again, we hear the Shabbat, we hear the 6th and the 7th. Interesting, by the way, to think of is that we have a story of slavery in Sefer Bereshit. Actually, it's slavery. And that is the story of Yaakov, Jacob working for his father-in-law Lavan. So remember the story over there. Yaakov runs away from home. His brother Esau wants to kill him. He wants to get married. In fact, he meets Rachel. And he's living in the house of Lavan, who's Rachel's father. And Rachel's father Lavan says to Yaakov, listen, because you're my relative, you should work for nothing, right? Avadatali, you should work chinam, you should work for nothing. Tell me what your wages are. So Lavan changes the relationship from his uncle, from uncle to nephew, called nepotism. But Lavan says, it's not going to work for me that you lounge around my house without working. But you know what? I got to pay you. Tell me what your wages are. Yaakov says to Lavan, I'll work for you for 7 years. And for Rachel, your younger daughter. He volunteers to work for 7 years. Presumably, because he understands that the marriage to Rachel is problematic. Because Rachel Bitcha Haktana, Yaakov presumably knows that normally you don't marry the younger one before the older one. Fine. And then, of course, Lavan cheats him, and he squeezes another 7 years out of Yaakov. But then Yaakov says, after these 14 years, I want to leave. I want to leave. I want you to send me away. We'll come back to that later. I want you to send me away. And Lavan says, please don't leave. Please don't leave. You're my good luck charm. And Yaakov makes this famous deal. Okay, I'll stay, but, I'll work for you and I'll work for myself. The speckled, spotted animals will be mine. The unspeckled and unstreaked and unspotted will be yours. And Yaakov manipulates the herd. And Yaakov recognizes that he's in trouble. He's accumulated great wealth. And he hears God speaking to Yaakov and saying, get out. After how many years is that? It's after 6 years. So it's actually very interesting. We have the 6 and the 7 in the Jacob narrative. The first one, Yaakov seems to volunteer extra work. I worked 7 years for Rachel, the younger daughter. Second set of 7 is just Lavan tricking Yaakov and getting him to repeat the original commitment. But the number of years that Yaakov works before he runs away, okay, is 6. So in other words, the point over here, you already have some kind of a basis of you work for 6 years, and after 6 years, you leave. Now, I'll come back to that story because after the 14 years, when Yaakov wants to leave, Yaakov says to Lavan, I want to leave, and I want you to send me away. So we'll come back to the idea of sending me away because the slavery comes up not only in Mishpatim, in our chapter here, but it comes up in 2 other places in the Torah. One of which is in Devarim. Maybe next week we'll take a look at that, about sending the slave away. You don't, in the book of Devarim, you don't send the slave away with nothing. When the slave is freed, you give the slave gifts. You give the slave the ability to function on the slave's own. Otherwise, the slave will have no livelihood. Now, let's read a little more about the Chumash. I want to make a point about slavery here. The Torah says in Begapo Yavo Begapo Yetze. Gapo is understood to mean if the slave came alone, okay? Then Begapo Yetze, the way you come into the slavery, the way you leave. For example, and in Baal Ishahu, but if the slave was a married man, if Yatsa Ishto Imo, his wife leaves with him. In other words, slavery, you're working for somebody for 6 years, so you're a married man, have a wife, so when you leave, the wife leaves. It's interesting to think about, interesting question that the Ramban raises at length is, when the master presumably has the responsibility to take care of the slave. The slave has no money, the slave works for the master. So the master has a responsibility to take care of the slave, let's say to room and board. So the slave has to be fed. The Ramban asked the question, who feeds the wife? Say wife and children. Whose responsibility is that? And the Ramban assumes, actually, that it's the master's responsibility. You purchase a slave, slave comes with certain responsibilities, room and board, and that's true not just of the slave. But if the slave comes with a family, then the same responsibility would extend to the family. However, now we have another rule. From our perspective, very problematic one, obviously, but this is what the Torah says. Im adonav yitain lo isha, v'yodol lo banim o banot, ha'isha v'yodeh tel adoneha, v'hu yitzei begapo. What if the slave was not married, but the master gives him a woman, gives him a wife, and they have children? Then the woman is a slave. She's a slave of the master, and she doesn't go out with him. She produces these children who are also slaves. So the master has more slaves now. The Eved himself, he leaves after his 6 years, and but he leaves alone. He leaves alone. In other words, the point of this is that the slavery is not just a kind of material relationship. It's not that the master owns my work, but the master owns my body, actually, which is one of the more problematic aspects of slavery, maybe the most problematic. This is what the Torah says in about 5. But now we have the following verse, which is very important. Imamar Yomara Eved, Ahavti et Adoni et Ishtivi et Bonai lo etzei chofshi. But suppose the slave says, I don't want to leave. I have this woman, I'm married to this woman. We have a family. I don't want to leave. And I even like my master. He's a good guy. And he's feeding me. In other words, there is security over here. Slavery, we think of it as an evil. And I think fundamentally it is evil. But it also gives one security. And the fact is, what if the guy says, I don't want to leave? I'm happy where I am. So now the Torah says, if that be the case, V'yisho Adonov Eho Elohim, V'yisho El Hadelet O El Hamzuzah, V'ratza Adonov et Adno B'matzeya, V'avodo L'yolam. So then the Torah says, if the slave decides that he doesn't want to leave, he has that option. And the Torah says, in that circumstance, the master brings him to the door or to the doorpost. He shall bore his ear with an awl, and he will serve him forever. Vavodo li'olam. Okay. The plain meaning is he's a slave forever. The rabbinic tradition is there's even a limit on that. But I want just to make a couple of, just to reflect a moment upon this verse, which I think is a very telling point. First of all, the Chumash says that it's very possible that the slave does not want to be free, that there are reasons that the slave may say, I prefer to be a slave. The reasons over here are, first of all, he has a family, he has a wife and children. But beyond that, I think we can understand that there is a certain security to slavery. You don't have to make your own choices. Someone makes all your choices for you. Someone is feeding you. Okay, the master, it's an institution that lends itself to all kinds of cruelty. It's very hard to, when you control someone else, you can misbehave, and it's very hard to enforce laws that prevent that. We understand that. On the other hand, it's possible that many people may say, look, we're slaves, it's not good, but what is the alternative? The alternative is very uncertain. I'm going to be on myself, I'll be alone, I don't know how I'm going to make a living, I have no family. I want to remain a slave. Says the Torah, you can remain a slave, but there's a procedure. We take you to the doorpost, the delet and the mezuzah, we bore your ear, and you are a slave forever. Now here's the point I wanted to make about this verse. The Medrash, Rashi actually quotes a Medrash, which why did we bore the ear of the slave? Says the Medrash, because the ear of the person who heard at Mount Sinai that I have redeemed you from the house of bondage, and you still want to be a slave, God freed you. So therefore, okay, we as a concession to human nature, we allow you to do this, but we don't like it. And picking up in the spirit of Rashi, what I would say is, Rashi doesn't actually say this, but I think in the Chumash, it's a simple reading of the Chumash. Because we remember, we left Egypt. In order to leave Egypt, something has to happen first. You can't leave Egypt till we do something first. And there's something we must do first, of course, is bring the Korban Pesach. And the Korban Pesach was an interesting sacrifice. It's brought in the house, actually. It's brought in the house, and it's brought on the house. In other words, you take the blood of the sacrifice, which normally is thrown on the altar, and you throw it al hamezuzot v'al hamashkof, on the doorpost and on the lintel. You throw it on the door, and the Torah says, I won't allow the destroyed angel to go into your house, to enter your house. In other words, the point of the Korban Pesach is, it's that which allows you to walk through the door. You're walking to freedom. You're walking through the door. You can't walk through the door till you first proclaim your allegiance to God. You proclaim your allegiance to God, right? As God says later, these are my servants. You aren't a servant to another human being. You're not someone else's slave. You're an Eved Hashem. That's Moshe's accolade. Moses is God's servant. So the idea of being God's servant is the goal of the Exodus. And that means if you're God's servant, you can't serve two masters. You can't be the servant of another, a slave of a human being. So the point is that the story over here, what's very interesting is that on one hand, what the Chumash is clearly saying, I think, in the context of the book of Shemot, that's the point I began with. These laws are not floating in the air someplace. They're in Sefer Shemot, and it starts with slavery. So what the Chumash is saying on one hand is, you shouldn't be a slave. Okay, you had to be a slave for whatever reason, we'll get to that. You were a slave, etc. But it's limited, 6 years. In the 7th year, you go free. But make sure you go free, on one hand. Because if you don't want to go free, you don't understand the whole book of Exodus. You don't understand the idea of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Korban Pesach. On the other hand, the Chumash has a concession to human nature. The Chumash understands that many people will be afraid to assume responsibility. And we have to remember that in the story of the Exodus, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that actually the Torah says we were thrown out of Egypt. We could not tarry. And the suggestion is, were we able to tarry? If we could have tarried, if we could have delayed, we might not have rushed out so fast. And we all remember that in the story of the desert, how many times did the Jewish people say, we want to go back to Egypt? We even said it standing by the sea. In chapter 14 in Yam Suf, we told you, Chadal mimenu v'navda Mitzrayim. Leave us alone, we'll be slaves to Egypt. We'd rather be slaves to Egypt than die in the desert. So the point is that the story over here, the law actually, is a perfect reflection of both the goal. The goal is not to be a slave. Okay, you are a slave, 6 years, but the 7th year, you've got to go out. Shabbos, 7th year. On the other hand, the Torah is well aware of human limitation. So it's moving towards the elimination of slavery. It's moving away from slavery, but it understands that it's a major upheaval because you have a pasuk which says, what about if he doesn't want to be free? That's who wouldn't want to be free? And the answer in the Chumash is many people don't want to be free. Many people. The Jewish people really who left Egypt on some level didn't want to be free because that was too much. So the law and the narrative actually come, the law is reflecting the narrative. That's the point I wanted to emphasize. Let me stop for a minute and take any comments or questions, and then we'll move forward.
Yes, Deborah Sondheim's been sitting on a question for a bit, so
Go
I'm
ahead.
gonna let her start first.
Go ahead.
I just had one idea I wanted to share. Many years ago, I'd asked my father, why would the Torah begin with this law? It was not at all as uplifting as the Aseret HaDibrot had been. And my father had explained to me that Bnei Yisrael were a group of recently freed slaves. And what would they most want to know about this new religion that they were entering in is how would slaves be treated? So therefore, as you mentioned, the topic that is most developed is the topic of slavery, that this would really be what would most fascinate them.
Yeah, for sure. That's so. It's a related point. But my point is that in terms of it's not just about these verses. I think in general, it's about understanding the context in general. There's a reason why in different places the Chumash has different sets of laws. There's no set of law that's actually complete. By the way, the same is true of something like Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code is not a complete set of laws. We don't have all the codes. We have this gigantic stele with all these laws, but there's no suggestion that's all of the laws. And in the Chumash, it's certainly the case that we don't have all the laws over here. There are many, many laws that don't appear here at all, and they appear other places in the Torah. So it's is deeply connected, of course, to the story of Exodus, which is all about slavery. You put it in terms of the psychology of the slave,
right?
Which may also be true, but it's addressing that which is front and center in the book. Anybody else have any comments or questions?
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
So I guess you're saying that the narrative helps us understand the law, almost as if this is a narrative. These are laws that we should understand well because of the narrative that we just read about that shows human nature in real life.
Right. I'm saying that. I'm also suggesting even more than that, that actually that the laws of the Chumash, and I think this is, to me anyway, pretty clear. The laws of the Chumash are given at a particular time. In other words, that it's not just a set of abstract laws, that the laws are related to the situation at that particular time. In other words, if someone were issuing a rule today about slavery, I think we would say slavery is out. There's no slavery. It is forbidden to have slavery. If we had to issue a rule today, I think all of us would agree. We wouldn't say, well, you can have slavery over 6 years. If the guy's married, he leaves with his wife, and if not, we wouldn't say that today. I think I'll speak for myself. I think I speak to everybody. Slavery is a bad institution. It lends itself to all kinds of mistreatment. It is dehumanizing, and we would all agree with saying, of course, eliminate slavery. We wouldn't say eliminate it mostly, but we can keep it. We wouldn't say that. But that's not what the Chumash says. And the point is, we have to understand the Chumash in terms of it's speaking to a particular bunch of people. It's not talking to us directly. It's talking to people a couple of thousand years ago, and it's a different world. The reality is the world has changed, not just in terms of technology and other kinds of things. People's thinking changes over time as well. Part of the challenge of religion, I speak for myself over here, challenge of religion is not just that things change from a technological standpoint. The fact of the matter is, the thinking of people changes. I'm not saying that human nature changes that much. I don't believe it does, actually. But I think in terms of what we believe, how we see the world, that has changed. The Chumash is not addressing the way we see the world. The Chumash is addressing the way those people saw the world, but the Chumash puts into motion a certain path. And I think the idea of the Chumash is moving towards eliminating slavery, but it understands it's not talking to people that actually is a reality. In fact, some of them actually prefer slavery. Some of them think slavery is not so bad. I know that may sound crazy to some people, but I'll tell you something else. There are people that are in prison, okay? And then they get out of prison. And they often go back to prison. And for some of these people, actually, this may sound crazy, but they prefer to be in prison, actually. The outside world is actually a dangerous place for them. They don't know how to handle it. They don't have the ability to handle it. They don't have the resource to handle it. And prison may be bad, but they know what it is. And they've been there many times. And for some people, I'm not saying it's for a lot of people, for some people, that's just the reality. And that's what it says in the Chumash. The guy says, I'd rather be a slave.
Yeah.
But the Jewish people said in the desert, we prefer to be in Egypt. We know what we got in Egypt, you know? Okay, they beat us up on occasion. We also had fish and we had cucumbers here. And we had onions and watermelons, you know? They forget, that's just human nature. And that's the people the Torah is addressing. Yes, Tova, what?
But first of all, Hans Fallada wrote a book about a man who is free from prison and what his life is
Right.
going back. I mean, this is not, a new thought.
Right.
But
No, I agree, right, sure.
but when the pasuk says that the master gave him a wife, and he
Yeah.
loves his wife and he loves his children, and he loves his dead, is he also making it impossible for the wife to get freed or his children to get freed? And maybe this is why he goes to the doorpost. I mean, because what happens to them? He's imprisoning his whole.
Right. What happens is the way the Talmud understands it. The way the Talmud understands it is this. The Talmud understands it the following way. The Eved Ivri for the Talmud is a regular Jew. In other words, he's obligated in all of the commandments. He's no different than any Jew. It's not like a Canaanite slave. The Hebrew slave is a full-fledged Jewish man or Jewish woman. We'll get to that next. Maybe we'll get to it next week. But the Talmud understands there's one difference between the Hebrew slave and a regular Hebrew free man. One difference, which is that the woman that's being given to this man as a wife is a Canaanite slave. She's not a full Jew herself. Normally, the Hebrew man is not supposed to marry a Canaanite woman, but the Talmud understands this parsha as that the Eved Ivri is mutar b'shifcha Kanaanit. So Shifra Kanai is like a half Jewish woman. And that basically, and she's a slave. Her children are not actually Jewish. The children are because it follows the mother. So the point is these kids are, in one sense, they're his children, in the other sense, they're not his children. And that's how the Talmud understands the parsha. But you're 100% right. The woman given to him is a slave of the master. She's going to stay with the master. She's not, and we understand very well why a person might say, look, this is a woman that I love, and I've been with her for 5 years or 6 years or whatever. We have 2 kids. I don't want to leave. And that's absolutely true. So that's how the Talmud understands it. Again, the Talmud in general, though, as I would say, it's fair to say, it's not our study, but the Talmud tries to basically eliminate slavery. The Talmud puts all kinds of parameters or limitations on the slavery. The Talmud Yerushalmi says the slave is, if you're in a house and there's only one bed, the slave sleeps in the bed and the master sleeps on the floor, So the Talmud is going out of its way actually to eliminate slavery, but it doesn't. It eliminates it in a variety of ways. It doesn't just say no slavery. It eliminates it by putting all kinds of limits, so many limitations on it, and so many qualifications that at the end of the day, it pretty much eliminates it. And whether there's slavery in the time of the Talmud is a very good question. We know there were some slaves in the time of the Talmud. But this raises a whole other question. Maybe we'll get to these questions. I think they're very important questions on different levels.
One other thing, can this slave be the Rasha in the Haggadah?
Well, let's put it this way. I think that the Torah is opposed. The Torah thinks that the Torah thinks that people should be free. That's what the Torah thinks. And that's our story. So the fact that the slave doesn't want to be free is a negative, but I think here the Torah is sympathetic on one level. The Torah doesn't say you can't be a slave. The Torah is sympathetic in the sense that people can't just change their thinking overnight. And it's true of the story of the Jewish people in the desert. The people who left, we have to remember this. The people that walked out of Egypt say on multiple occasions, let's go back to Egypt. That's just what the Chumash says. You don't change your thinking overnight because someone gives you a new set of rules. And the Torah says, and the Torah allows the guy to do this. By the way, I will say one thing about this before we move on, which is that when the verse says, Avado li olam, the slave then is a slave forever. The Talmud says li olam doesn't mean forever. And we'll get to this maybe next time. Li olam means, because there's another parsha in the Torah, in Vayikra, where it talks about the slave going free in the year of the Yovel. Every 50 years there's a jubilee, and the Talmud understands that to mean that every slave goes out in the jubilee year. Even the slave who said, I want to be a slave forever, whose ear was pierced, will be freed in the jubilee year. So we'll have to see this. This is one parsha about slavery, but there were two other parashot in the Torah about slavery. And maybe next week we'll deal with that. But the other piece of this slavery thing is not the man who was a slave, but the woman. And we'll get to that next. The Omo Ivriya, here the Torah has a very interesting move about female slaves. The Torah tries to eliminate female slaves, actually, by transforming into something else. Yes.
Do you have time for one more question?
Yes.
Vered?
Yes,
Vered?
Varda, yes. Yes, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We know that the Korban Pesach was done after putting, of course, the blood around the mashkov.
Yes.
And then the family, as you said, exited as whole. The slave that's leaving, if he's leaving his wife and children behind, he is not exiting as a family. He's exiting as himself. His blood goes on the ear and he goes out, but they stay behind. There's a very big difference.
That's true. And the actually in the story of the Exodus, that was Moshe's argument. Paro says to Moshe, whom do you want, let's say, to go out to the desert to serve God?
Correct.
And Moshe says over and over again, the old and the young, and the men and the women, we all have to go together. That's 100% true. In fact, when we left Egypt, the Korban Pesach is called the Zebach Mishpacha, a sacrifice of the family.
Exactly. And this guy is supposed to leave his mishpacha behind. Not only that, but the next law that came in Vayikra actually tells you why, so he can get back his nachala for his family. So
right, but the point, but understand that, but the point over here is that this woman is, I mean, he calls it his family. The fact of the matter is, this woman is a slave woman given to him to produce children. It's not exactly the ideal family, so it's a little more complicated than that. But I actually agree with you. I think the Chumash is fundamentally against this, and the Chumash is limiting it. Remember, slavery was assumed to be forever. That's the assumption. You buy a slave forever. Here, the Chumash says you only have a slave for 6 years, and the 7th year there's Shabbos and goodbye, and he goes out for nothing. He doesn't have to pay you anything. He automatically goes out. That's a tremendous change. So that's, in other words, I want to emphasize that the Torah allows for slavery. The Torah disapproves of slavery, strongly disapproves of slavery. It's against our narrative. It's against the story of the Exodus. We're in total agreement about that. I'm just saying what's here.
The Torah also understands his progression. And there's a difference in procreation between men and women, as we will see shortly. But the Torah does not limit his procreation. The Balabayit, his Balabayit gives him a wife and enables him this. Later on, what happens with the family is a little bit of a different question. but the Torah is mityaches to the man and the woman differently, but both have the rights of procreation.
That's true, but on the other hand, if he leaves, he leaves the kids with the master.
Yeah.
He has children, but he doesn't. But they don't leave with him. That's the problem. And
That is the problem.
we'll deal with
Yeah.
this all next week. We'll continue next week with the
Wonderful.
second part, and then we'll deal with it's a big topic and a very central topic. Obviously, there's the parasha, the parasha in Vayikra, there's the parasha in Devarim, and there's the next parasha of the Omo Ivriya, which is very interesting, which we'll turn our attention to next week. We'll spend one more week on the slavery, and then we'll move to other of these mishpatim. There are a lot of them, and they're extremely interesting. Okay, it's good to be back with everybody. Looking forward to. If anybody has any questions, you can always email me at dsilber@drisha.org. Welcome all the emails. Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you.
Darla, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for one of the first classes of Sfira Zman at Drisha. And if you want to join us for more classes, both daytime and evening Eastern Time, you can find out more at drisha.org/classes. I hope to see you all next week. Thank you and take care.
Thank you, Kayla.